first time I heard the word Sanibel was when they would announce over the loudspeaker that the Sanibel bus was late. And then later on, as the days progressed, I met two people, Ralph Woodring and Jim Pickens, who were in some of my classes junior year at Fort Myers High School. And about Christmas vacation, my curiosity brought me to Sanibel. So I came here somewhere a few days after Christmas in 1952, just to look around and see what was here. I thought those guys were pretty neat, and still do, as a matter of fact.
Yeah.
And later we moved to Naples, and I finished high school at Naples High, and then later went to work for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and I guess it was sometime in 1957, working in red tide research as a fishery assistant. And it so happened that Tommy Wood, who was the manager here at Sanibel, was also a part-time pilot. He would fly the coast, and one of us assigned to the lab in Naples would go with him to collect water samples and collect water chemistry. And after some, I guess, 6 or 7 months, they decided to move the lab from Naples to St. Petersburg. And I had the opportunity to go to St. Petersburg, but I chose not to, and it so happened at that time Tommy Wood told me about a position that was opening up on Sanibel, so I applied for that. And I came up here with him in '57 to look over the island, see if I in fact wanted to take the job if and when it was offered to me. And finally, in the latter part of 1958, it was offered to me, and Jean and I brought Leslie. Leslie, my daughter, was only 2 months old at the time. We moved lock, stock, and barrel to Sanibel, came across on the ferry with a borrowed pickup truck and a couple of friends of mine, and we unloaded everything in the lighthouse building, quarters number 2. We called them quarters, now I guess they call them cottages. But I guess officially they're quarters 1 and quarters 2. And we unloaded everything, and then we went to do some sightseeing. And we jumped in this pickup truck, and I wanted to go check out the Bailey Tract. And Richard Beatty, a dear friend of mine, another friend I've lost contact with, we decided we'd drive through the Bailey Tract. Well, we did, and we got stuck. And the last ferry left here at 5:30, I believe, and we got stuck around 3:30, and there we were. We couldn't get out. So I don't know, one of us, we either hitchhiked or went down to the Standard Station. And after some pleading, we got Cliff Grimard, who used to live on the island. He had an old Jeep, and he came down and pulled us out. I made the last ferry. And then a few days later, we moved to the island, and we moved into the lighthouse building. And there was there were no appliances, things like refrigerators or even a hot water heater. And unbeknownst to me, the government should have supplied these to me, but they didn't. So out-of-pocket expenses included a new refrigerator, a new hot water heater, to the tune of like $1,200 back in those days, and for which I've never been reimbursed. And so we had all of our belongings in the lighthouse, but since I didn't have any plumbing, any kitchen sink or hot water heater, we moved into a little cottage that was across from my quarters 2, that was built by the Coast Guard back during the war years. And we lived there, I think, for like 2 weeks. It had running water and a hot water heater and a shower, while I was building kitchen cabinets and getting the house prepared to live in. So we stayed there for 2 weeks. And then I moved into the lighthouse, and over the years it was just a massive remodeling, keeping things, trying to keep things up.
Describe what it looked like physically. I know the ceilings were like these, with 12-foot ceilings or so.
Mm-hmm. I believe the ceilings in the main part of the house, the square part of the house, they're 12'8", if my memory serves me right. And then the other, there's a fireplace. They were coal-burning fireplaces. They weren't wood-burning fireplaces. They were in each room in the main house. And then the little wing that in mine went off to the east, it was the original kitchen. It has a chimney in it. I guess they're probably still there, unless they've boxed around them or something. And when I moved in there, that was that kitchen wing I turned into a hobby room. I had aquariums and turtle tanks, and I had 82 different species of turtles in that room at one time. One of the largest collections in the country, outside of some of the big metropolitan zoos. And the living room was going straight up the stairs. That was straight ahead, and the kitchen was on the opposite side of the house, and then we used the 2 bedrooms. And the roof leaked like a sieve. No air conditioning. I lived there without air conditioning for 10 years. And my rent on that house, I drank cistern water for drinking water. We had a shallow well, but it was not very potable. It had a distinct
Sulfur?
not sulfur. It was a shallow well. It had just one of these decaying, not quite as bad as sulfurous dioxide gas, but it would later become the same compound, I suppose.
On its way.
On its way. And the roof leaked and no air conditioning. We didn't have a telephone. We applied for a telephone, but we didn't get a telephone until sometime in the early 60s. My wife could tell a few telephone stories, especially when the children were ill, and how people would work together and help each other. I forgot what I was talking about there, Betty. Got off on a little tangent. Oh, I was going to talk about the fact what the rent was in that house.
Oh, yeah.
My salary back in those days, I believe I was paid bi-weekly, I cleared $126 every 2 weeks. And my rent was $4.50 a pay period. So I paid about $9 a month to live in that house. And I paid $9 a month up until the latter part of the 60s. Then the government finally got into the housing business and kept raising the rates.
Tell us about, Chuck was born while you were on the island, and we didn't have a causeway. Talk a little bit about that whole evolution.
Well, let's see. Chuck was born in '61. Hurricane Donna was 1960, yeah. When it became nearly the time for the event to happen, Jean would go and spend the days with her mother in Bonita Springs so that she could be close. Both of my children were born in Naples, and so she could be close to the hospital. And Chuck was born in Naples, and then she came back, I think 3 or 4 days later. I brought her back to the island. It was really quite comical. Here she comes home with a brand new baby, and her father and my father, I hired them to rebuild the original fishing pier because there was no labor here. So they had come over and moved into that house with us. Here's a little 3-year-old girl and a newborn baby, and I guess it was really hectic. Jean often talks about that. That was, I think, about a high point of our... But the year before that, Hurricane Donna, after Donna, we left during Donna. I was afraid of, Clarence Rutland always told me, don't stay in those buildings because if the water comes up, he says, your car will be ruined and you can't escape if it washes over the point. So we left, went down to my folks in Naples, and we had no contact with the island until they had Civil Defense had a meeting at the Naples High School, and I talked to one of the Coast Guardsmen who had flown the coast, and I asked him about the lighthouse building. I wanted to know if it was still standing. He says, "Oh yeah, they're still there." So we managed to get back to Punta Rassa, and the state now Marine Patrol. It used to be the Florida State Board of Conservation. They had a 40-footer called the Punjab, and I came back to the island on the Punjab, the state boat. Jake Stokes and other boats were running people back to the islands. And then we had to walk from Bailey's store on the bay to the lighthouse. And as I recall, it was a very tedious job because trees were down, there were docks and things on the road and the trails. Mm-hmm. We managed to get home, and up in the lighthouse, I don't know what the elevation of the floor is, but the floor was covered with almost a half inch of sand where the wind had blown it underneath the doorways. Mm-hmm. And there was some guttering down and some broken windows. I lost some books because of water damage. But what I'm getting at is at the very point of the lighthouse, the storm had windrowed a big triangular area of trees and dead crabs and fish and birds, which began to ferment. And for days it was unbearable. So I actually sent Gene and Leslie off the island then for about 2 weeks, I think, because it was just, you cannot imagine the odor, and there was nothing that you could do about it. Yeah. And of course we didn't have power or telephone. Thank goodness we had gravity feed cistern water to survive. Really? I'm rambling around.
No, you're not doing. Well, you mentioned that this dining room.
Oh yeah, I mentioned this dining room. After Donna, we didn't have enough pressure, system pressure, to take showers and those kinds of things. And everyone that could work, every piece of equipment, tractors or jeeps, worked to clear periwinkle, because periwinkle was, impassable. So we would all work. I would run the government jeep, pulling trees and pulling wires and those kinds of things. And then at the end of the day, I would go down to Walter Strong's motel.
Which was?
On the Gulf, on West Gulf Drive. I believe it was called Whitecaps. Mm-hmm. Walter Strong owned a motel, and he was also a mail carrier. And he had a gasoline pump on his shallow well, so we could get a shower. So not everyone, because everyone didn't do the same thing, but those that I was working with, we all went there. And then we'd come back here to Clarence Rutland's house. And Clarence would have been down to meet the mailboat that brought ice over, big chunks of ice. And then we would sit, Clarence and Tommy Wood and, I've forgotten some of the people, Tom Bellheimer and Martin Hires, and just the old timers would all sit around here on the porch and in here, and Clarence would crack ice and put ice in glasses, and everybody would sit around and drink whiskey until it got dark, and then you went home and went to bed. Fought the mosquitoes, then got up and started over the next morning.
How long did it take, the clearing?
I think that to clear it, I want to say it took, over a week to go from the station to that's where the damage was, primarily the station to the community house. For the road, it took a good week, but then it took longer for the power line. After we got the road open, we then started on the power line. I felt my work on it fell off after we got the road open. I think the ferry landing was out for like 3 weeks, and they couldn't get 2 or 3 weeks, and they couldn't get the trucks over here to rebuild the line. So as soon as the citizens got periwinkle open, then they jumped on the power line so they could be ahead of the game to reconnect. But at the lighthouse, it was 5 weeks before we had electricity restored, and it was 3 months before the telephone was back in the refuge office, was working.
You mentioned doing some red tide research and smelly after the hurricane. Mm-hmm. We had a pretty substantial red tide in 71.
We sure did. I think on a scale of 1 to 10, that had to be a 10.
We'll go along with that.
That's not long after you and Jim
Right.
came to the island. That's when I first met Jim.
Yeah.
In fact, on the turtle runs that year, it got so bad, just the aerosol, coming off the water at night, we couldn't drive. We had to finally shut the operation down for like a week. But when I first got to know Jim, is because the Jeep, we had like 1 week we had 16 flat tires because of catfish spines, and I had to take the Jeep down to the gym to get it repaired, get the flats repaired. But it was bad. It's just unbelievable. I mean, everything from the high tide line out died. I mean, the coquinas, and it was just unbelievable.
I remember the county putting loaders out on the beach and digging trenches and pushing the stuff into it.
There's a trench at the lighthouse that it's out on the front part of the beach. It's west of the lighthouse. That they dug a trench there 100 yards long and probably 40 feet wide, and there are billions of organisms buried there. Unbelievable.
But you stayed there through it was about 6 weeks
Yeah,
or so.
we stayed there. The odor then was dependent on the wind.
Yeah. Well, tell us a little bit about Tommy Wood. He was the first refuge manager.
He was the first real refuge manager with that title. There were a couple of other people that would patrol this area prior to Tommy, but he was the first one assigned here permanently. He was, he was born in Ozona, which is up the coast near Tarpon Springs. I believe it's north of Tarpon. He was born August 20th, 1903. He soloed. He was an airplane pilot. He soloed in 1927 and served in the South Pacific and the U.S. Navy as not as a fighter pilot, but as one of these flying boat pilots, seaplane pilots in New Caledonia and Australia. After the war, he came back and opened up a seaplane service in the Keys called Wood Seaplane Service. And he would shuttle fishermen and people to the Tortugas, and he became friends with a refuge manager in the Florida Keys named Jack Watson. Jack was really a legendary person. That's a whole other gang of stories. And he became friends, and Jack hired him as the title back in those days was laborer patrolman. He hired Tommy as a laborer patrolman, and he would use his aircraft incidental, personal aircraft incidental to that, just to patrol the areas. And then in 1949, he was offered a job as the laborer patrolman on Sanibel, a permanent job. So in April of '49, he moved to Sanibel, and he lived on Ding Darling. He became good friends with Ding Darling, although he never called Ding Darling Ding. He always called him Mr. Darling. It was, a great deal of respect. And Ding Darling somehow provided some temporary quarters for Tommy up on Captiva for a while, and I guess then he moved into the lighthouse building in quarters 1 in 1950. When I came over in '57 for the checkout to see if I wanted to come here, him and his wife Louise had bought a house on Woodring's Point, the one that Jack Thomas, well, not the one, but the piece of land that Jack Thomas built his home on. And they were living there in '57. When I moved here in '58, they were living back in quarters 1, so they were my neighbor. And by that time, the refuge system had bought him a government aircraft, and he was promoted to refuge manager. I think through the years that I worked with him, I think we had 3 different aircraft. And he would land we had a dolly, a cradle that we would land the airplane in Tarpon Bay or in Pine Island Sound, depending on wind, and taxi up to the bank. He would run the boat up on a large wooden base that had wheels on it, and then I would winch it up out of the water where it would be high and dry. And then when the mosquito control district was finally winding down most of their ditching, they needed to do a little extra work and to keep the drag line busy. So they decided, as they went further west with their west of Tarpon Bay Road, they decided to. Well, Tommy somehow conned them into digging the ditch wider than normal. So Tommy and I went out there with a couple of 2x2s, and we laid it out. We knew where the boundaries were, and we laid it out. But we didn't have any instruments to do it with, so there's a definite, you look down that canal, there's a distinct jog at the end. And then we built a new dolly there, and we had a gasoline tank for the airplane. And that's about a half-mile long, and it was one of my chores was to maintain the dolly, maintain the gasoline supply, and also to keep the fringes of that ditch clear of plants, Australian pines and those kinds of things. Keep them clear of the wingtips. But it was I guess looking back at it, I don't think I'd want to fly out of that canal today. But I was young and foolish and didn't mind it a bit. I learned to fly coming out of that ditch.
What were some of the areas he went to in the plane? What were the responsibilities?
Well, we would have regular areas that we would patrol, do census work from the airplane, like all through Pine Island Sound, Estero Bay. And then he would be sent down to the Keys and do all the Keys, like the great white heron counts and those kinds of things, and then law enforcement patrols. And then north as far as St. Mark's Refuge.
Yeah, that far.
And then he would be involved in the midwinter waterfowl counts and the spring eagle counts. He was on the go quite a bit. Okay. Of course, that left me here all by myself.
Now, there was in one of the histories, Emmylou Lewis was flown up to Tallahassee by Tommy Wood for
the old Ding Darling committee when they were trying to get the state lands transferred to the Fish and Wildlife Service. You know, back in those days, the Fish and Wildlife people in Atlanta were much more cooperative, less bureaucratic, and supported, you know, the move that was being made here and sanctioned him doing that. Right. Although his involvement with building the Ding Darling dike in the refuge was no official connection between him and the Fish and Wildlife Service. The committee appointed him chief engineer. Well, it became the Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, but we appointed Tommy as the chief engineer to build that dike, and he would take Colin Moore. Colin was the dragline operator. Well, he's the one. There were two or three dragline operators, but he's the one that did stayed with it through the entire project. And he would take Colin up in the airplane, and they would get up over it and look and say, well, he said, take it from where you are now to that point. And Colin would get out on the machine and he'd dig to that point. And they'd fly the next 2 weeks and do the same thing. And Colin got out to where Colin's Point is in the refuge, and Tommy wanted him to go across Hard-Working Bayou to tie the dike into the outer fringe to give a panorama of the sound. But the water got too deep and there was a lot of coquina rock, and so they decided to make a hard left turn. And Colin's Point is since washing away. I had always hoped, I had a sign there at one time designating it, and I had always hoped to give it some recognition, but it's never happened. It needs to be done, some kind of a plaque or something, because without Colin, you know, his perseverance, that thing wouldn't have been the way it is. And I think this is a story I'll tell on Colin. We also ignited Colin by practically every day taking a 6-pack of Bush beer out there, and it gave him the incentive to do it to the way that Tommy wanted it done. Right. And I'll bet if that dike was dug up, there'd be bush cans from it end to end. And I must say that late in the day, Tommy and I would often partake of a cool drink with Colin. He was quite a character.
Is Hardworking Bayou, was that named at that time, or was that a name that was there before?
No, we called it Hardworking Bayou.
Okay.
I think it's
So-
based on it was hard to fish.
Oh, okay. Okay, I was just wondering whether it was because it was hard to dig.
No,
through
it was
or whether
called
was-
that. Yeah, I think it was just a hard spot to fish because of depth. It was good fishing, but it was hard to work nets.
Okay. Mhm. There used to be parties under the buildings.
Mm-hmm.
at
You
the
remember some
lighthouse.
of them?
I remember some of them, yeah.
Yeah, they used to have the annual 4th of July picnic,
Mhm.
and that was put on by the, what was it, I guess the American Legion put it on, yeah, and Alan Nave, he was one of the chief cooks, and everyone on the island was there. That weren't very many people back in the early 60s, but it was a real big affair. Then it just got out of hand. Just got too big.
Yeah.
They had at one time a little Kinsey Park, which was at the end of Ferry Road on the Gulf side. Kinsey had a little park there, but it got too big for that. And then the Legion started having it when they built the Legion Hall. They moved it there. But after that, I had some of the turtle people. We had an annual party there. Some great times, great cooking. And of course, when I first moved there, in that house, I could stand on that back porch. And I have movies of my mother and dad walking underneath the house in knee-deep water shelling. And on a high tide, I could take, when the mullet were running, I'd take a cast net and throw it off the porch and fill my net with mullet. And I've caught snook off that back porch. So, you know, and then I would have picnickers up under the house constantly. People,
Yes.
they'd actually have enough gall to light their barbecue grills up under the house. So that's when we first fenced it. It got
Yeah.
just too much to handle.
Mhm. You said you had torn down some buildings down there, the observation tower that had been standing, the government wharf.
Yeah, there was an old, some of the old photographs, you'll see an old wooden tower that's right on the point. There was a conflict between the lighthouse service and the Coast Guard, and they wouldn't let the Coast Guard use the lighthouse for observation, so the Coast Guard had to build their own. It was about a 40-foot high tower. It's a commonly constructed tower you see at life-saving stations like over at Stewart, the House of Refuge. It was just a little cypress cabin up on top of some telephone poles, and it had cables that guided it all together. But by the time I got here, it was leaning over quite a bit, and island kids would climb up in there. We were afraid it was going to, blow down, and so I was given the orders to burn it down, and I burned the thing down on the beach. Some of the old concrete supports are still there, and then at the old fishing pier, which was the original Coast Guard dock, there was a boathouse that had a railway that went out into the bay. The Coast Guard would keep one of their vessels there back in the early days, and it was falling apart. So I actually bought that building. I bought that building for $5, and I demolished it on my own time. My brothers would often help me, and my brother-in-law, and we dismembered it and took it down to Naples and built a hunting camp, which has since burned down. And then, of course, the pier, we rebuilt it, as I said, back in '61. And then somewhere about 1967, we took the roof off the original pier and then rebuilt it again. And then in 71, after Tommy had retired, I was in charge, and I made the decision to close the pier. And I was under a lot of criticism for doing that by people on the island. But believe me, if I hadn't taken that action, there never would have built a new pier. Never would have been a new pier built there, as there is now, because, I had calls from the regional director telling me of the Fish and Wildlife Service, telling me how unhappy he was that I took that step. But I was afraid the damn thing was going to fall down and someone would be killed and swept away in that current. That's how bad it was.
Yeah.
So I just closed it down one day, and then the phone started ringing. And then I had one of the leading citizens of Sanibel stand at the bottom of a ladder, cussing me out with some pretty strong and serious language. And I recall, like, Bob Sabatino. Bob, he's a fishing guide on Captiva. He used to work with us part-time in the summer. And we're putting a roof on the shop building, and this language was bouncing back and forth. And I grabbed my hammer, and I started down that... Are we still taping? So I started down that ladder with my claw hammer to confront this person. And Bob pulled me back, and I cooled off. But I doubt if this person really had enough intelligence at the time to recognize the benefit that me closing that pier had made for the island. So I never got any credit for that one. But there would be no municipal fishing pier. But I took the flack. I probably, that's about the time my promotion stopped. My rent went up too. They jacked my rent up to $200 a month, so they were getting even.
It took them several years too to get
it all together. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, they were being. That's because they were being stonewalled by the Fish and Wildlife Service. Designs. And, I mean.
What was the extent of the refuge when you came here in '58? What was the acreage?
Well, we had the.
What were you in charge of?
We had the Lighthouse Point under a revocable agreement with the Coast Guard. That was supposed to be 54 acres, but it was only like 23 because the rest had all washed away. We had the 100-acre Bailey tract on Tarpon Bay Road that the service had bought. It was not a gift from the Baileys, as some people think it was. The Fish and Wildlife Service bought it for the sum of $5,000, $50 an acre, in about 1950. And there were some leases, some private leases, like up at Stewart Pond, which is up near Chateau Sommer Park. Some of that was leased. And then there was a general lease of some kind for some of the state-owned lands. But prior to the refuge being established, I still have some of the old cards somewhere. There were some petitions that were signed by people on the islands to establish Sanibel and Captiva as sanctuaries, and I think in '35 they were set up as sanctuaries under the Florida Game and Freshwater Fish Commission. Through a special act through the legislature where if the county had so many people, you could actually enact these little sanctuaries. And there was the Lee County Refuge Commission was formed. And when I came here, that was Tommy Wood, Francis Bailey, and an elderly gentleman on Captiva. I've forgotten his name. And they sort of supervised them. But then that status was lost. Those special acts, they expired or something, maybe based on population. And then there was still some kind of a lease agreement on some of the state lands on the north of Sandcap Road, but there was a lot of private ownership. There was like a quarter-mile overlap in townships and surveys that was, no one knew who owned what where is what it amounted to. And it wasn't until the service started the acquisition program until that was all straightened out. But that's all. And then Dr. Perry died, and well, I guess her will was probated. I think she died before I came here, but I'm not sure. Her will was probated, and she left the Perry tract to the refuge.
And that's what, about 3 acres?
And I think it's about 3.5.
Yeah.
It's 550 feet of Gulf front.
When did the offices go down at the lighthouse again? If Tommy Wood was living in one and you in the other one?
Well, the office was in his quarters. You go up the stairs and make a left in that northeast corner. Yeah, one of his bedrooms. And then when he retired, when the next manager came in from Montana, we just changed the whole building into. No, we had one of the employees lived in part of it as an apartment, but we used the main part of the house for office space. I think 3 of the rooms became office. And then later, the entire building was used as an office.
Well, some of the beach changes, some of the physical changes build up in erosion. You were talking about fishing off of the porch, and then it has built up and disappeared over the years, and you've done a lot of moving up and down the beach. You've seen a lot of these changes.
You see them, but they don't really register. I can speak, there's a dramatic difference there between the way the lighthouse point is now and how it was then. And before I came here, there was a great expanse of land out in front of the lighthouse. Some of the early photographs show that, and I know I've talked to some people like Joe Whiteman always tells me about the time he threw his hat off the lighthouse, and it sailed out across towards the Gulf, and it took forever for it to reach the water, and how they used to play baseball in front of the lighthouse. So there was a great deal of land there, so it comes and goes. I've seen changes along the beach. Tahiti Shores area, and of course Bowman's Beach, Turner Beach area has always changed. It always will. They're putting blame where I think blame isn't really due on some of these issues on erosion.
Can't give it a fixed point when it's not.
When it's not fixed, right.
Well, what about some of the changes in the wildlife, in fish, and shells, and the changes in landscape, the vegetation?
Well, the vegetation has really changed. When I first went in the Bailey Tract, I mean, you could stand there and the only Australian pines you would see were along Periwinkle, and there was another road south of where West Gulf Drive is now that ran from Casabel to Island Inn, and there were pines along there. And a few scattered small ones to the west of the Bailey Tract. But it was just a savanna habitat, spartina grass and cabbage palms. It was rather unique. And of course then Brazilian pepper got a foothold. I actually planted Brazilian pepper. Tommy and I, Clarence Rutland, after we had been partaking of beverage in this very room, Clarence took us outside, and from here there was a little shed off to the left, and Clarence ran a little nursery operation. He made a few bucks to get by. And he had this potted plant. He said, and this is a beautiful Florida holly. He said, the birds just love it. So Tommy and I took that Florida holly and went down to the airplane site, and I planted that Brazilian pepper, and right where I planted it.
Is it still there?
No, it's gone. However, that coconut palm that's there, I planted that coconut palm. It's 33 years old. It's the lone sentinel.
Yeah,
but we planted Brazilian pepper for wildlife food. Little did we know.
Yeah.
Tommy also brought the pig frog to Sanibel in about 1950. The big, they call it the southern bullfrog. When you hear in the marsh grunting, he brought 49 of them over from Loxahatchee Refuge and turned them loose. And they're all over the island today. And some other plants, like that banana water lily that's growing in the Bailey Tract, and some of the round stem bulrush, he brought all that in here from the East Coast.
Talk about some of, you had mentioned tagging alligators at one point.
Yeah, before I came to Sanibel, I had a project, a state authorized project to work on alligators in Collier County. And we had a group, and we tagged alligators in Collier County, handled like, in 2 or 3 years, handled like 1,500 alligators and applied tags. So when I came to Sanibel, in the summertime, I had an opportunity to work on sea turtles, but spring and fall, I worked on alligators. And I became president of the local Audubon about that time, I guess 61 or so, 62. And I talked the board into funding alligator projects, so they bought me some alligator tags, which I used up over the next few years.
Describe that process a little.
Tagging the alligators? Yeah. Well, we used to use, we would catch an alligator, you would catch it by hand or with a special pole or other techniques that they still use them today, noose techniques and those kinds of things. And then I used what's called, before I bought the Monell tags, I had what they call a Peterson tag that the state supplied. And it's a little wire you put through the tail of the alligator, and it has two little yellow discs, numbers, that are put over that and then held in place by bending the wire. And that didn't work too well because they pulled out. And then the Audubon Society bought me the Monell tags. It's the same thing that we still use for sea turtles today. And it was just applied with an applicator through the tail. And then we noted some loss because of that. And then we started clipping the keels on the tail in codified technique. And I guess that's still being used today by the alligator handlers. But I had a narrow escape with an alligator, and I gave up alligators. In fact, I've had a couple of bad escapes. Well, the worst, the most painful one was the 1971, during the 1971 red tide. Had a call, there was an alligator in the Gulf in front of Island Inn. And usually I would say, well, just leave the alligator alone, because they do go in saltwater. But Ed Phillips was down working on turtles, and George Weymouth was around then, and the three of us decided let's go down and fool with this alligator. So there were several hundred people at the site by the time we got there. We waded out and tried to herd the alligator up in the shallow water. It was about between 5 and 6 feet long, pretty strong animal. And we got it up into away from the wash channel up on one of the bars, and I could see it down through the water. I guess I was probably in water just below chest deep, and it was just being still on the bottom. So I was a little too deep, and I went under. I straddled it and went under, and normally I would grab it behind the head and get a scissor, get a hold of the head with my left hand, the jaws, and my right hand on the foreleg, and a scissor, and walk it in that way where it couldn't twist on me. But it was so deep, and I guess it was because of the distortion, my right hand ended up in the alligator's mouth. And here I was, and believe me, if you've ever been bitten by a 5.5-foot alligator with those sharp teeth, in excruciating pain, and hundreds of people, at least 100 people, watching you, and you wanted to scream at the top of your lungs, and you didn't want to lose control because of that fact, but you didn't want to lose control of the alligator, because believe me, if I had pulled back and let that animal twist, goodbye hand. So I had it between my legs, and it wouldn't, I'm waiting for it to relax, and it wouldn't relax. So I took my thumb and forefinger on my left hand, and I just gave it the old eye push, and I kept pushing and pushing, and finally it began to relax. And I got my hand free, and I recaught it. I took it in, and I gave it to George. Eddie was not an alligator person; he was a turtle person. So George took the alligator, and he bound it, and I ran up to Island Inn, and I watched the blood off my hands, and to see how severe it was. And all it was really just puncture wounds, because I didn't allow it to move or do any twisting or shaking. So I cleaned it up real good, and I put some iodine or something on it and bandaged it. We went and tagged the alligator, turned the alligator loose. Now, bear in mind, I was doing all of this in red tide tainted water that was pink red. I woke up the next morning, and I went into the bathroom to get myself ready to go to work, and I couldn't believe what I saw. I had big water blisters. Some of them were 1.5 inches in diameter, all over my body. The other guys had been in the water. They hadn't been affected. I think something
Got in your blood.
got in my bloodstream, and I had some kind of a reaction to it. It was just, it was like somebody took a hot coal and just burned me and raised blisters. I couldn't believe it.
So red
And to
tide pox.
Yeah, red tide pox. And I don't, I say, hey, I'll give this a while and see if it goes away. In a couple of days, they dried up, but it was. I'm sure Jim probably saw. I was showing everybody those things.
Yeah. I just don't remember this one.
Yeah. Yeah, that was something. That was one narrow that hurt. Then I had another one. A larger alligator almost got my face, and I just decided I'd give it up then.
Okay.
And then a few of my friends that picked up the ball on alligators after that have had some very serious injuries. George Campbell was badly bitten. Bird Westall nearly had a very, very severe bite. It's for the young people now, agile people now, yeah.
Yes. Well, when the Causeway controversy surfaced, what was your
My
reaction
thoughts on
to
it?
that, and
Well,
what do you remember about it?
I was against the
Generally?
Causeway.
Mhm.
I'm still against the Causeway. I think the Causeway just ruined this place.
Yeah.
The combination between the Causeway and the water system, those two things, and this island has since then degraded in my way of thinking. And everything has changed. You talk about habitat changes, but the wildlife has changed. The people have changed. I went in to vote yesterday. I wasn't going to vote, I said. But George Zajac called and said, let's go vote. So we went to vote. When I came to Sanibel, I registered for the first time. I was the 105th registered voter on the island. Francis Bailey registered me. I walked in that community house yesterday, and of all the people milling around at 10 o'clock in the morning, I saw one familiar face. I just couldn't believe it. I knew no one.
Yeah.
It's just boggles my mind the way it's changed.
There's what, 4,400 registered
Yeah, something like
voters
that.
or something, yeah. What about the roads? The road system out here and the general transportation. Going out to Captiva, was it?
Well, the road, Sandcap was surface when I came here, but it was rutted. The speed limit was 65 miles an hour on that road when I came here. I think the speed limit on Periwinkle was like 45. And of course, Casabel was sand. Dixie Beach wasn't here. Dixie Beach Boulevard wasn't here. Rabbit Road was sand. And there was nothing off on the sides other than those roads. There was Gulf Drive and Periwinkle and Sandcap and Rabbit Road, Tarpon Bay Road, Donax, and then there was another one through the trailer park.
Right.
I've forgotten the name of that road. And then Beach Road. Well, there were people that were for the Causeway and people that were against the Causeway. I don't know if there were any, I don't recall any straw votes being taken. There probably were. Willis Combs, he led the fight against the Causeway. But the county commission, they were, bound and determined they were going to go ahead and build that bridge. And then Bailey's wouldn't give them, they wanted to land on what is now Bailey Road, but Bailey's wouldn't give them the right-of-way. Hugo Lindgren jumped right in and gave it to them. And that just gave fuel for the fire. And here came the Causeway. It wasn't too bad at first. It was sort of nice. You could, go in town, go grocery shopping, go to the movies. The kids were sick, you could get to the doctor or the hospital. And it wasn't until probably after 65 that it really started to mushroom.
Now that was a political thing, and there was planning people that were trying to, zoning and planning, I forget the exact title.
We had our own zoning and planning board.
District,
I forget what it was called. It was
Yeah.
Joe Galt and Jimmy Jack and I think John
Leroy
Continos.
Friday was involved.
Yeah, I think Friday was involved. And the county sort of,
Made it illegal.
Well, they sort of pampered it, I think, you know, that they were working towards the same goals, but the commission, I've forgotten the commissioners back in those days, their names even, but they were hell-bent to build the bridge.
Yeah.
Because a few years ago, they had built the bridge to Boca Grande, not Lee County, but the bridge had been built, so that they could see great things happening to Boca Grande because of that bridge. So Lee County wanted their bridge.
They wanted to build a road the whole length of the Barrier Island.
Oh yeah, there was a
road
plan
out
in the Lee County Transportation Department up until probably the early '70s that showed that. I don't know what happened to it.
Bonita Beach roads and all that were
Bonita
part of it.
was built the same thing, but they couldn't raise the money, I guess, to bridge. If they could have raised money, or if they had planned far enough ahead, which they never did, they would have had these bridged, every one of them.
Yeah.
I don't doubt that a bit. But now it's out of sight. They couldn't afford it.
And then in 1974, we did become a city. And you were one of the first councilmen.
I think it was definitely a step in the right direction. We look at what's happened to the island since '74, and it may not look that good to us. But just in retrospect, think of what would have happened had we stayed under good old Lee County. I mean, condos, they were permitting condos on the ground at 44 units per acre. It did grant us the height limitation, but that would have been knocked down by now.
We would have had those 90,000 people they were expecting.
That's for sure. And you know, I try to give that message to people that come over here and say, "Oh, this place is built up." You know, some of my relatives that have never been here. My God, I didn't think Sanibel Island was like this. I said, "Hey, wait a minute. What would this place have? You don't know what this place would have been. You know, now had we not taken steps back years ago to change it." Yeah. I just wish that this island had been 10 miles further out in the Gulf of Mexico.
Out of sight, out of mind. Well, tell us about Coretta Research.
Well, Coretta is a program that, see, when I came here, I started working with sea turtles, and it was just myself and my wife and my children, and then people became interested, and Tommy Wood supported that type of thing. And I recall having a talk with him and Ding Darling. When I first met Ding Darling, it was like, I want to say February '59, and I was putting, it was early, I was either putting up the flag or I was painting the flagpole or something at the lighthouse. I was at the flagpole. And this car pulled up, and this older man got out with a cane, and pretty good sized man. And he walked over to me and he said, "Oh, you must be the new man." Hell, I was only 22 years old or something. I says, "Yeah, I'm Tommy's new helper, and Tommy Wood's new helper." He said, "Well, I'm Ding Darling. I live up on Captiva." He said, I hear you're interested in snakes." I said, "Yes, I am." He said, "I just saw the most beautiful indigo snake crossing the road down by the school." And then he went on to tell me about this beautiful indigo he had seen. So he went up in the office and visited Tommy, and Tommy yelled at me to come up and have a cup of coffee. So I went up and sat in Tommy's kitchen, which was in that west wing of quarters number 1. And we talked about snakes, and the subject got on turtles, and Ding Darling thought something ought to be done about the damn raccoons that were eating all the turtle eggs. Well, Tommy said, "Well, Charles, just the person that he'll probably be doing something about it." So that's how I started. That summer, that summer in '59, I started patrolling the beach, and when we moved here, we had a brand new car. It was a Ford. I bought it brand new. It was like 3 years old. And I put Gene and Leslie in the car, and we'd run the beach in my car. And I ruined that car on the beach in the salt water. Then the government, we got a new Jeep, an older new Jeep, and a newer old Jeep, and I began to use that on the beach. And by then, enough people had generated an interest that we wanted to do things with the turtles. We wanted to learn a little more about them, so that's when we formed Coretta in '68. And
The first
pardon?
#1 permit.
Yeah, turtle permit #1. Still hold that permit. And then over the years, we did a lot of good things, and we learned a great deal. And then in 1990, when I retired from the Fish and Wildlife Service, I wanted to begin to do other things. And I was looking for a way out from all the responsibility and reports. And then last year I turned the program over to the Conservation Foundation. They'll be doing the summer work from now on. We're still keeping Coretta just to keep our permit and attend meetings.
Mm.
But I don't plan to be active anymore.
What other things would you like to talk
I
about?
don't know. Do we run through your list?
There's a name you mentioned, and said Jack Watson was
Yeah.
an interesting person in the
Yeah.
Everglades.
Yeah, Jack Watson was one of the early labor patrolmen that worked the Florida Keys. But see, back before the Everglades National Park, it used to be Everglades National Wildlife Refuge, and it had its headquarters over at Dania on the East Coast. And Jack's responsibility was patrolling the entire Everglades, all of the South Florida Peninsula, by boat and Jeep, what have you. And he became notorious in the way he would treat poachers and things. And
Something about that Watson name.
yeah, I don't know if he was any relation to Ed Watson down at Chatham Bend. That's a possibility.
Yeah.
But come to find out, and Tommy Wood didn't know this until later, Jack Watson was also born in Ozona,
Yeah.
in a little backward town on the Florida coast, and these two people that became
Cool.
friends and co-workers were born in actually the same little town. Strange. But Jack was a gung-ho law enforcement person, and he was the only law on the Upper Keys.
Mm-hmm.
He did work with deputy sheriffs, and when the Cuban crisis was happening, he was arresting, I mean, just the firearms that he took from Cubans filled a warehouse as big as this room. And he was really involved. And he had the habit of, if he'd see a light out in the marsh, he would just as soon take a Thompson submachine gun and just, come on out of here. I'm Jack Watson, federal agent. You know, that kind of stuff. And like the old J. Edgar Hoover FBI days. So he had a reputation. He was here for the dedication of the refuge back, I guess, whenever it was dedicated. At the formal dedication sometime in the early 80s.
Yeah.
He's since passed away. Tommy Wood passed away in February of 1990 at 86 years. If he hadn't been crippled, I still would have jumped in an airplane with him because I trusted that man's flying in.
Yeah.
Really something else.
Other things you want to?
I can't think of anything. I mean, so many things to talk about.
I guess we'll just get you back and think of more things.
Yeah,
Okay. Mm-hmm. Sure.
I think
Maybe